I specifically do not use the rhetoric of smartness. I specifically do not talk about smart cities because for a couple of reasons. I don't think cities can be smart, and I'm not interested in building towards that. What I'm interested in is cities that make us smarter, cities that support the natural abilities of humans to make sense of their environment, make meaning in their environment, and make beauty in their environment. And I think that the whole rhetoric of smart is frankly kind of misguided. But we face a struggle ahead of us in terms of explaining why that is. It's a very, very powerful discourse, and it's becoming widely pervasive. So I think those of us who are not invested in that rhetoric need to do a better job of explaining what some of the problems with it are and what the alternatives to that way of thinking are. Inevitably in this space, you're going to get techno-determinist thinking, you're going to get techno-utopian thinking, you're going to get a line of thinking that suggests that if only we had this benevolent intercessionary power operating on our behalf that had been perfectly programmed to anticipate our desires and to deliver things to us, to deliver situations to us, that would be a better way of approaching the urban landscape and everything that happens in it. And I just don't buy that. I'm not, as it happens, particularly fond of artificial intelligence as a discourse. I think that people are already equipped with everything they need. We just need to provide the support through technology that is respectful of existing practices, existing ways of placemaking, existing cultures of citying. And the degree to which we as designers can do that, the better. I can give you some practical examples. It is very, very often considered to be the state of the art in information technology to do what's called context-aware computing. That is to try and infer things about my desires, or to try and infer things about what sorts of notifications or what sorts of alerts might be of utility to me by my behavior or where I am or what time of day it is. And I just, until there's some kind of perfection in the world that is able to determine that sort of thing accurately, I've never once seen that work. I've never once seen a technical system that's able to properly anticipate my needs and desires. And so instead of that sort of thing, I'd much rather have an open, flexible platform that I was able to make use of as my needs change throughout the day. I don't find there to be that much practical utility in this notion that the network can somehow anticipate from the fact that I'm in Berlin and it's the middle of the afternoon and I'm in the company of two other people, that notifications should be delivered to me in such and such a fashion and not some other fashion. It's trying to design that level of intelligence into a system is just so far beyond our capabilities, and I dare say might never fully be within our capabilities. I'd rather have a humble, respectful technology at my command instead of something that tries to anticipate. So what I in fact believe is that we should be thinking very carefully about a network of open public objects. And it's a complicated idea, but it can be broken down fairly easily. An open public object, what is a public object? It's any data collecting or data gathering thing that exists in public space or is acted on by people in public space. What do we ask of these public objects? We ask that the data streams they produce be open and accessible and freely available to everybody. Why do we ask that? We ask that so the value that's locked up in that data doesn't become the private property of any one entity, whether that's a public or a private commercial entity. What we believe is by making free access to that data available, that everybody can share in it equally and produce value that we cannot anticipate at design time. As a designer, I don't have the arrogance to say I know ahead of time what people are going to make from this data, the sorts of services they're going to build on it, the sorts of opportunities that are going to be created with it. What I believe instead is that people will have the ingenuity to figure out what they need to do for themselves in their own contexts, in their own communities. So what I'm arguing is that we need to have enshrined in law a recognition, a definition of what these systems are and what they can do, how that data has to be made accessible, legally, technically, and socially, so that everybody who has the technical wherewithal and the understanding can reach into those systems, take that data, make use of it in their own lives in ways that make sense to them, and that is a very, very large challenge. I think the level of literacy in the new class of urban technical systems is something that we're ultimately going to have to address. And when I say ultimately, I don't mean in the distant future. I mean very, very soon now. These systems are already out there. They're already beginning to affect people's lives. And so if somebody was to point out to me that you already need a very high degree of technical competence to be able to make use of these things, to be able to write scripts for them, or to be able to reach into them through what we call an API, an application programming interface, that's absolutely correct, right now. But I think that is the designer's craft. I think the mission that we have before us now is devising high-level user-facing systems that make the power of these networked objects apparent to people, that surfaces the power, that makes that power self-evident to them, that says that, there are all of these underutilized resources in any city that you care to name. These resources are out there. If we make of them networked objects, people can grab those resources and people can put them to the uses that they have in mind. One of my favorite examples at the moment, and something I like to talk about, there's a Japanese project called Mega House. And the idea of Mega House is simply that all of the underutilized spatial resources in the city right now, if you put them up online and you represented them accurately, you could open up access to them. You could turn them from privately held resources into shared public resources. So if I have a conference room, right now, and it's in such and such a neighborhood, and it can seat 8 people, and there's a projector in that conference room, and it has Wi-Fi. If I characterize those qualities of that room, and I make it available, and if I've designed the service that wraps that properly, then people can find that. And instead of having to rent a conference room, or instead of having to have a dedicated facility, or instead of having to travel halfway across town to get there, people can search, the universe of available possibilities and say, hey, look, this is accessible to me in my own neighborhood. Why don't we use it now? Why don't we take advantage of it? So in the same way that you could schedule a conference room in a corporate building, you could turn the entire city into a collection of resources like that were available to people and that they could, reach and grab and take advantage of. It's an exciting prospect to me. So another clear area of interest is transit informatics and transit information. And I think we are already seeing public transit authorities around the world beginning to conceive of their networks as things which need to be made available online. The really interesting thing is, how do people feed back into that system? How do people contribute the information that they have at their fingertips and help the online representation be more accurate? And the answer I have for that is quite simple. If we had an open framework that the transit authority published their data, then if you knew that there was some slippage between the representation of the system in that data and reality, if you knew that the bus was not actually going to arrive at 10:07, that the bus was 5 minutes late, and that was characterized properly, you could push that back to the system. And if many riders did that, then you could begin to show a visualization of the system that reflected that. And it would be more accurate. It would have been precisely tuned by the individual actions of a great many people, acting from the bottom up. And that kind of emergent structure, and that kind of emergent order, I have a great deal of hope for that. I think that that's the other piece of the puzzle that we so far haven't really enabled. And I think that the power of the individual voice in that context becomes really important, becomes really crucial. Transit authorities around the world are already publishing their data through APIs. They're already, as a matter of fact, a great many of them are conforming with something called GTFS, which is the General Transit Feed Specification that allows other software services and systems to make use of that. But that's almost less interesting to me than what happens when you empower the people who are out there on the street to participate in that representation online. If you give people with mobile devices the power to say, you know what, the bus that was supposed to be here at 10:07 isn't here and is 3 minutes late or is 5 minutes late. And when you aggregate all of those responses, and when you can build a visualization of the actual situation that represents what people are doing, and what the people as sort of the distributed intelligence nodes of this network are telling you. That's so much more interesting to me and so much more hopeful to me than any sort of top-down representation of things. So privacy concerns, are always going to be, they're near and dear to me personally, because I was told by a very wise person a long time ago that if you have location plus any one other piece of information about yourself, you give away the whole game. And so in public space, in the city, heretofore we've had the promise of anonymity. That's what big cities are good at, is sort of wrapping this shroud of anonymity and privacy around people. As a matter of fact, in American law, unless you're a celebrity or something, you have a reasonable expectation of anonymity in public space. That's what public space means. We're now at a point with mobile devices and increasingly with the networking of the environment itself, where we have to have a really similar conversation about privacy in public space as we've had around privacy on Facebook or privacy with social networking tools. We are giving so much information about ourselves away, and we'll be giving more. And my only hope is that we get something valuable in response, in return for that. The increasing networking of the urban environment, I think, inevitably means that we'll be giving more and more personal information about ourselves and our activities and our intentions away, just simply as a fact of being in public space. And my great hope is that by devising our laws and our understandings around the networked city properly, we can get something of value in return. That it doesn't have to be a one-way transaction, that we're not simply giving things away and that somebody else is building value on that, but that ultimately that value gets returned to us as citizens and as constituents and as co-creators of the city. My own personal belief is that we're at a point already in the developed world and pretty soon everywhere on the planet that we're going to have to reckon with this class of technologies in our jurisprudence, in our law, in our explicit public understandings of the rights and responsibilities that surround these technologies. And unfortunately, at least where I'm from in the United States, that is nowhere on the radar of the legislators or the regulatory community at all. They've barely begun to reckon with these questions, even concerning more conventional technologies like Facebook, let alone the robustly networked urban fabric. So we're quite a few years behind, and my concern is that we're already getting into a place where these technologies impact day-to-day life. They already impact my freedom in the city. They already impact the outcomes I have available to me and the choices I have available to me. So law needs to hurry up and catch up with this. Our choices are already being conditioned to a great degree by these network technologies. The experience of the city is already being shaped by them. An example would be Foursquare, the locative technologies. When somebody posts that they're on Foursquare and all of their friends show up there, if you don't have access to that layer, to that informatic layer that is superimposed over the city, you have no way of knowing why all of these people are suddenly showing up at one bar and not the bar next door to it. You have no access to that information, and it can materially change the course of your evening, and in some cases it can materially change the course of your life. So one thing that naturally occurs to me is how do you take that information and make it visible to people who don't happen to have that service or maybe even don't have a mobile device? We need to do a lot more thinking about this because not everybody does have a mobile device. Not everybody does use these services, and yet their city is already being shaped by them in some pretty powerful and subtle ways. I do have a vision of what I think of as an urban operating system, a service that gathers all of a municipality's functions and is both citizen-facing and municipality-facing. So something that unites public transit and garbage collection and the library and all of these functions of a city. The trouble is that a lot of people have that vision, and they have different takes on it. So the American writer Greg Lindsay talks about what he calls a battle for the soul of the smart city. And he says, on the one hand, you have these organizations like IBM or Cisco or Oracle that are very invested in this notion, but and certainly want to sell the hardware to cities around the world, but that haven't really given much of a thought as to what role the individual citizen plays in that conception of the smart city. And on the other hand, you have a great many people, like the people who are present at the Cognitive Cities Conference today, who I dare say are approaching things from a more user-centered and a more bottom-up perspective, and are arguing that if there is to be a smart city, and if there is to be an urban operating system that binds together all of these functions of a municipality, then if you're not including the individual citizen constituent in that from the very beginning and designing it around their needs and their requirements and their desires, then you're designing for failure. And my own great hope is that we do a little bit of consciousness raising and get the average citizen invested in what's at stake. Because once these technologies are deployed, they'll be there, if not forever, for quite a long time. And they will profoundly affect every aspect of our engagement with the urban places we call home. I want them developed with regard to... how do I want them developed? I want them not designed and developed by people who don't have my needs in mind, but sensitively to the needs and requirements of the ordinary everyday citizen, and we're quite a long way away from that at the moment. I think one of the things that the networked city can do for us, it goes beyond situational awareness to effectively granting us a new sensorium, entirely new kinds of senses. And I don't mean in the banal kind of augmented reality way. I mean, augmented reality is sort of a catchphrase that you hear a lot in the last couple of years in technology circles. And the idea would be that you'd hold your phone up as a visor and you'd basically, have information superimposed on that over the world around you. And that's not that interesting or appealing to me. I think the idea of people, stumbling down the street with their phones in front of them it's just not what cities are for. It's not particularly urbane. It's not a pleasant vision. I think instead of very carefully crafted ambient information that's just sort of available in the environment and that effectively does augment reality, just not in the way that we're currently used to it, and gives us entirely new senses for danger, senses for possibility, senses for opportunity. A sense for when and where, exciting things are happening, or when and where things are happening that I'd want to steer a clear path around. Senses of all sorts that are fed to us through the torrential volumes of data that are even now being gathered by these networked infrastructures. And my sense is simply that we have to craft the presentational layer, the way in which that information is offered to people so that it responds to their ability to understand it. And that's about data literacy. I mean, that particular question is about data literacy and data visualization literacy. And again, that challenge is something that our educational system hasn't even begun to beat its head against. We really do need to start thinking about data literacy in the early childhood years, so that the generation of people that's going to grow up with these technologies will be able to make optimal use of them. The flip side of all of this is that being granted these new senses unavoidably means that I'm being sensed as well. And again, the notion that I keep coming back to is that we have to strike a balance between, if I want this new power, if I want this new ability, which really is almost superhuman in its implications, then perhaps it's not so inappropriate to ask that I be willing to give something of myself as well. Here comes the plane again. This is just amazing. So there's a camera in the vending machine, and there are CCTV cameras on the street, and everything that we do, in some maximal sense, is going to be visible. Not merely visible. My contention is that these technologies actually redefine surveillance, because it's not so much the direct gaze that is relevant now as the analytics that are applied to that gaze. When we bring that video information into a place where we can predict people's behaviors, we can look at whether or not you're paying attention to a billboard, we can infer from the movement of your eyeballs what part of that billboard you're paying attention to, and then we can correlate that with your age and your gender and maybe even your ethnicity. And then we can begin to build predictive models on that. That is an entirely new conception of being in public, and it is deeply disturbing to me. But I think it's far, far too late to stop that. If we can't stop that, what can we do? What we can do, I would argue, is that we define these data collecting resources as open public objects. And we do that precisely so the value that's inherent in that data collection activity isn't locked up, isn't in some sole proprietary context where nobody else can get access to it. It's opened up so that you and I can gain access to that information, and we can apply the same interpretations to it as anybody else can. So whatever value is latent in it is shared equally and by the public. So another challenge that I speak about is something that I call differential permissioning, which is a model of access control that's ultimately derived from computer science. In networking computers, you have something called an access control list, or an ACL. And any user that is not on that access control list will be denied the use of certain facilities. Because we are beginning to layer public space with the same computationally mediated technologies, we're beginning to import that access control model from the computer network into physical place. We're beginning to instill in public space itself this notion of differential permissioning, and it's about who you are and what credentials you have in a very, very subtle, very powerful way. So if you're not the right person with the right credentials, you will not be allowed to use certain parts of the city. They will be made inaccessible to you. What's particularly disturbing about this to me, I mean, after all, we've had walls and barriers since the beginning of human habitation. That in and of itself is nothing new. What's particularly disturbing about it to me in the new paradigm is that we don't have recourse. There's nobody that we can necessarily complain to in real time. If we have this access control list mediated ability to get around public space and I'm locked out for whatever reason, who do I complain to? You know, in the old days when there was a barrier with a guard next to it, you know, you could negotiate with the guard. You could attempt to seduce the guard. You could attempt to threaten the guard. There are all kinds of things that we had worked out, all kinds of conventions and ways to work around that system that we had developed over very, very long stretches of cultural time. When that access control is distributed throughout a network, I have no recourse to it. I certainly have no recourse to it in real time. So if something is forbidding me from entering that door now, there's virtually nothing I can do about it. As a matter of fact, I don't know where that denial has been encoded. And again, that is different from the situation that is obtained throughout 5,000 years of human habitation. We need new ways of thinking about these contexts and circumstances, and we need them soon. Another issue that arises almost immediately when you're talking about an open infrastructure of networked objects is, if you'll excuse the jargon, what I think of as issues of precedence and deconfliction. Who has priority? Who can use these systems in preference to other users? And what I'm calling for is new protocols and new etiquettes that surround the differential use of these things. Obviously we have bodies of law and custom that have grown up in response to our conflicting needs to use physical space. You know, we drive on the right side of the road, and there are rules that obtain that basically govern my conduct. You know, can I drive here? Can I turn here? You know, if I'm approaching a four-way intersection, who gets to move through that intersection first? We have no equivalent etiquettes or protocols about conflicting requirements over the use of public infrastructures, public network data infrastructures. So we're going to have to work these things out. And we're going to have to work them out with reference to the existing cultures of every different place that adopts these technologies. A perennial concern of mine is when the understandings of culture that exist in Japan are engineered into a system and it's deployed in Ohio, or when a system that is developed with recourse to a Californian understanding of place and culture and protocol and propriety is deployed in Mongolia. Places are different from one another. It sounds fatuous, but it's true. It's very true. Places and people are profoundly different from one another. And the trouble with these network technologies and the modularity and the lightness and the ease with which they can be redeployed in new contexts is precisely that you can wind up imposing your cultural understanding of things that's inscribed in the technology at the layer of its code over the people who use it in a place that's remote from the place in which it was designed. And that's just going to be problematic for me. Networked information technologies are very frequently sold to us under the twin banners of convenience and security. And I guess I'm always moved to ask, convenient for who and secure against what? One of the things that concerns me is that if we bring this notion of efficiency to the fore and everything is oriented around maximal resource utilization efficiency and throughput and the streamlining of all of our relations, what do we lose in that exchange? And one of the things that I believe is that we lose a great deal. We lose that downtime and the interstitial moments that we literally cognitively need to make sense of things.